Example, clone, change, and commit. This is an extended example walking through using multiple tools, starting with cloning using GitHub Desktop, changing code using Visual Studio Code, and then committing using GitHub Desktop again. And then we'll check to see that those commits have then shown up on GitHub itself. So to start, let's clone some code. So I'm going to go ahead and move over to GitHub Desktop. Notice I don't have any existing repositories stored on this machine, and I'm logged into my MD tutorial account. So as a reminder, when you first start GitHub Desktop, it will ask you to log into a GitHub account. I've currently already done that. If you don't currently have any repositories, it will then ask you if you would like to clone a repository from the internet. And over here, it will give access to the current repositories I have associated with my account. Now, as of right now, I only have a single repository that is a fork of another account. So as a quick review of the terms fork and repository, a repository is a collection of code, data, code, source code, files, something like that. And when we use the term fork, we are describing a copy of an existing repository. So there's an existing repository created on another account. I have forked that repository. I have a copy of that exact same code, and now I want to work on that code. Before I can work on the code, before I can make any changes, I need to make a local copy. In GitHub and especially Git terminology, we call this cloning. So notice one of my choices over here on the left-hand side is to clone a repository from the internet. I'm going to go ahead and select that. Now it says, okay, which ones would you like to select? Well, here are the current ones I have access to, and then here is where it will clone locally. Notice usually, especially on Windows 7 and Windows 10, it clones to the username, the documents folder, GitHub, and then whatever I select. So if I select this, it said, okay, I will clone this based on this repo's name to this exact folder down here. So if I click clone, give it just a moment, it will clone, that is, it will make a local copy of those files. Now notice we're right back here and it says, okay, how are you planning to use this? Will you be contributing to the parent project or for my own purposes? Right now, I'm going to select for my own purposes. And I'm going to click continue. Okay, so I have a local cloned repository. Again, clone is a copy of an existing repository in another location. So I have a clone of it, which means I have local files I can now access. Well, GitHub Desktop is a pretty useful tool for working with GitHub, but it doesn't really provide an interface for working with files. So I'm going to go ahead and open Visual Studio Code, and I've gone ahead and opened it already over here. Notice I have nothing open. It doesn't have any folders or files currently open. So I'm going to open the folder I just created using GitHub Desktop. So I cloned an existing repo, I made a local copy, now I'm going to open that local copy. So in Windows, if you're using Visual Studio Code, this will be File Open Folder. If you're using Mac, it will be File Open. So File Open Folder, given that this is Windows, and I'm going to select the folder I just created. Notice it's under Documents, GitHub, the exact name of the repo I just created. Select folder. Okay, we'll give Visual Studio Code just a moment to open everything. Okay, and now we see these exact files opened right here in the exact format that they had listed. I have 3 files. I have a folder right here that also has its own files. So you may have noticed actually over here, this third icon, source control, had a little like busy icon going on. Well, it detected that this was a GitHub repository. Now, it detected that because GitHub Desktop, when we clone something, creates a hidden directory. It creates something with .git endings. And so when it created that subdirectory, which we can't actually see in Visual Studio Code, but when it created that, it then signaled to any other programs like Visual Studio Code that this was a GitHub repository. In which case, source control functionality then switched over, it read those files, and it would allow us to make those changes. So okay, I'm in Visual Studio Code. I want to make some changes. We've gone over the first verb I wanted to cover, which is cloning. That is, we made a local copy of existing files. Now we want to make some changes. So what I'm going to do then is, for the sake of this example, I'm going to create a new folder. So I can do that in Visual Studio Code through placing my cursor, first making sure Explorer's open, but placing my cursor over here in the sidebar. And then I want to go to New Folder, which is the second option, a little plus and a folder icon. And I accidentally had week 3 highlighted, but I'm going to call this example. And so be very careful what you have selected. I accidentally had selected this folder right here. So I'm going to click and drag this outside of that folder. And it says, hey, do you really want to move this? And I do. So fantastic, we now have a folder called example. Now, something to remember when working with Git and GitHub is that folders don't exist unless they have files in them. Now, that may seem like a strange thing to say because obviously we have a folder here. But notice over here, it didn't detect any changes. And in fact, we can verify that. If I go back to GitHub Desktop, we can see even though I made a folder, it doesn't show up under changes right here. So folders don't exist, or directories don't exist, unless they have files in them. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Now we're back to Explorer. Okay, I have a folder, and I've made sure I've selected the right folder this time and closed week 3. I have example selected. I'm going to create a new file. So I can do that through the little plus and a icon right here, new file. I'm going to call this index.js. Okay. And then remember, when we give something a JS ending, Visual Studio Code understands that this is a JavaScript file, and in case we're not sure, it lists JavaScript down here as the language mode it is running in. It also gives a little icon next to it of JS so we know. Okay, so now we have a new file inside of a new folder. So we know now that that folder exists according to Git and GitHub, because obviously, why have empty folders? So the other thing we can verify is if we move back to GitHub Desktop, we now see we have a single changed file, example/index.js. Now I want to give some content to this file before we commit it. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code. So again, I have a single change, and if we're ever unsure, we can also check these colors. Let colors guide you in Visual Studio Code. So we now have changes. Notice if I click here, it doesn't show those changes, but this is green right here, changes, and the U actually helps us as well as a little icon for untracked, which means we haven't committed those changes yet. So all of this is to say is that the colors help us signify that we're making changes. Okay, I want to write a little bit of JavaScript code, which I'm going to use the global object console and its method log, and just say hi. That's all I want, and I'll give a space at the end. Now, I'm going to save this file. In Visual Studio Code, there are 2 different approaches to doing this. You can always go to File, Save, or notice the keyboard shortcut Control+S. I've gotten used to using the keyboard shortcuts, so I'm going to use Control+S this time. So I'm going to get out of this menu and press Control+S and save this file. If you're using Mac, it's Command-S. So a substitute for Control for Command on Mac. Okay, so we've got a file and we've got a new folder, so we've made some changes. So something to remember then, as I talked about in the video on terms and concepts, that when we talk about a commit, it is a set of changes, so 1 or more changes. Let's go back to GitHub Desktop. So GitHub Desktop, right? I have this open. It says, okay, you've changed 1 file. What did I change? Well, I changed this right here. And it's true. I added, notice a little plus sign right here, I added this single line. Fantastic. Okay, so whenever we submit a commit to a repo, so I have a local repository that is a clone, right? I have local files. Whenever I submit a repo, I need to give a summary and optionally a description, but it needs at least a summary. So what did I do this time? So in this session where I changed code, I changed this file. And notice down here, it's smart enough to say, hey, we think that this is create_index.js, but that's not actually what I want the summary to say. So if I click in here, I'm going to say example commit, right? And optionally, I can add a longer description. So say, for example, if I edited a whole bunch of files or I changed things, I could give a longer description to explain those changes and put them in context. Let's say, for example, I changed some files or I updated some data. I might want to give a longer description to say exactly what I did. For the sake of this, though, and notice sometimes I misspell things, we have example commit. Okay, so notice there is no spell check in GitHub desktop, and I will occasionally misspell things. So example commit as the summary of what we did. So creating example commit. Now I'm going to click on commit to master. Now before I do that though, I'm going to describe what is going on. So GitHub uses the terms master to describe the current main branch of a repository. So again, remember that a branch is a version of code. So if you want multiple versions, you can create multiple branches. But in this case, we have a single branch, which in this case is called master, using that terminology. So I'm going to click commit to master. And then notice down here it says committed just now, example commit, and of course I can undo that. So now I have a change on my local repository that does not exist on the remote repository hosted by GitHub. So as we remember then, when we're talking about one repository compared with another, we talk about the terms ahead or behind describing commits. So again, a commit is a set of changes. We made some changes, now we've committed those. So now we have a change that the other repository does not have. So we are ahead one commit of the repository on GitHub. So remember then in terms and concepts video that I talked about pushing and pulling those commits. So we make some changes, they get combined into a single commit, and then we push or pull those commits when we're talking about two different repos in relationship to each other. So I have some changes. I want those changes to appear on the GitHub repository. I do that through pushing those changes. So I say, hey, here are these changes. I am pushing them to you. So notice over here, it's changed its terminology. It used to say fetch origin. Now it says push origin. And over here it says push commits to the origin remote. You have one local commit waiting to be pushed to GitHub. So I can either click push origin here or push origin here, depending on how I want to approach it. And I'm going to do it up here. I'll click push. It says pushing the origin, and we give it just a moment. And then it refreshed, and notice that I am now in sync with the repository hosted on GitHub. So let's verify that. I'm going to move back to Firefox. And notice right here, it says this branch is even. So let's refresh the page because it won't auto refresh. Oh, so now this branch is one commit ahead of Fidelis Master. So on the original repository of which this is a copy, it is a fork of, I am now one commit ahead of that original repository. So this branch is one commit ahead, exactly as it says. Now, you'll notice right here that the summary of the previous commit I just did 2 minutes ago shows up right here and who did it. So let's click on commits right here. Notice 4 commits. And we see my name, the example commit, and all previous commits. So any commits that we apply to this repository, including those that came along with the forking process, are now part of the history of this project. So any changes we make or any changes that we accept, again, because we could also pull changes, so any changes we accept are now all part of this change. And it gives us the exact time, so date September 9th, as well as committed 3 minutes ago. And if we even wanted to break this into greater detail, we could click on this and see the exact changes I made. So, okay, it gives me an email account and says, okay, we changed one file, and we can browse those files if we wanted to. So fantastic. So let's review then the things I've done in this extended example. I first started with GitHub Desktop, so I'm going to move back there. And I did not have any existing repositories on this computer. The very first thing I did was clone an existing repository. I cloned a repository I had forked previously. When we talk about the terms fork, remember it is a copy of another existing repo. So in a previous video, I forked that repository. Now in this video, I then cloned it. I made a local copy of it. Once I had a local copy, I could then edit those files, which I did in Visual Studio Code, which I'll move over again to that. And I made those changes. Then once I created a folder, once I created then a file, I had changes I then want to to commit. So again, a commit is a set of changes. I then moved back to GitHub Desktop. I gave a summary, which is required. Notice this is summary required and lighter text here. Gave a summary of what those changes were. And then I pushed that commit, that set of changes, locally to the remote repository on GitHub. And when I did that, and I clicked push origin, it put those changes on GitHub, which then we could see immediately on Firefox as I have it open here. And as a reminder, all commits, just including those we make or those we pull or those we push to this, are all counted towards the total number of commits for this repository. There's a total of 4, the one we just did and the 3 previous that we gained when we forked this project. And as one more reminder, when we're talking about a repository compared with another one, we talk about being either ahead or behind in a number of commits. This repository currently, this example one, is 1 ahead of the repository it forked from. So it is 1 commit ahead of Fidelis Master. That was the original repository. We are 1 commit ahead of this. So we're using multiple tools to do this example, primarily Visual Studio Code and GitHub Desktop, but the terminology is fairly easy to get into once we start thinking about this, right? We made a local copy, we made a clone, we edited those files in Visual Studio Code, then we combined those changes into a commit and then pushed that commit to GitHub finally.